What is up, everybody? My name is Nick and I'm a super nice guy, and today we're here to make a heartburst animation. So when you click on something that you're liking or favoriting, it will have a nice little burst that will delight users and look really cool. We're going to use a little bit of Illustrator, mostly After Effects, and then we're going to export or upload it with Lottie files. Let's go. Cool, so before we begin, we're just going to need to gather the assets we'll be using here. And to make this really simple, you can design your own heart icon. If you have an asset you're working with for, like a real life product or something, go ahead and download that SVG. But if you don't, you can just go to Google Icons here and download the favorite icon, and I'll provide a link in the description below so you can grab this here. But you'll just click it and you'll need to download the SVG. But one caveat is the SVG won't be able to be pulled directly into After Effects, so we're gonna need to just pull that into Illustrator really quick and do a little asset prep, which really just entails saving it out as an Illustrator file and maybe editing it slightly in the layers panel to accommodate your needs. But I'll go over that in just a second. All right, so the next thing we're gonna wanna do is, well, first a quick note on file management, organization structure, and all that. We're just gonna wanna make sure we have a folder here for After Effects and somewhere that's easily accessible, an assets folder, and that's where we're gonna save our heart asset. So wherever you downloaded it first as an SVG, we're gonna just drag that into Illustrator here. So once you've dragged in that asset, it's gonna come in super tiny because it's like a 24 by 24 pixel icon, but we're just gonna select the heart here, copy that, press Command N or Control N or File New. We're gonna bring up a new artboard. Let's just make it really large, 1000 by 1000 pixels, should be great. Once we hit OK, we get that, and then we can just paste in that heart here, and then we're gonna scale it up fairly big. So one thing to note when working from Illustrator into After Effects, this is how you prep all of your vector assets that you want to animate here. And if you have multiple assets you're working with, having them separated in the layers panel will ensure that every piece can be animated individually. Here we just have one heart asset. We don't really have to worry about that, but we will want to name this just something like heart icon, because when we import that into After Effects, it will retain that name. It just makes things a lot simpler. It's a great habit to get into. The last little thing I will touch on here is maybe I think this heart is a little too tall and I want it kind of, just a little bit shorter or something like that. To note, what we're looking at here is essentially, it should be imagined as the After Effects canvas, the composition we're going to be working in. So this entire artboard here is essentially our After Effects canvas. When we have a heart in the center here and we import it, it will import it directly in the middle of the composition in After Effects. So that's really all you need to know. The composition, you can retain everything when you pull it in, and then the layers panel, naming any piece you want to animate, having them pulled into separate layers here. So we're good to go, and actually we just need to save this as a heart icon.ai. I already have that here, so just make sure it's an Illustrator file and it's called something like heart or heart icon, and then also you save it in a location that makes sense relative to your After Effects folder. Cool, now that our assets are prepped and we have our plugin, we are ready to rock, so let's fire up After Effects and get into the fun stuff. Alright, so here we are inside After Effects. We're just going to work with a new project here, and inside that project we're going to set up some folders to set us up for success, really. This first one I like to call Assets. I'll type 00 Assets to keep it in the proper order that I'm used to. Then 01 Pre-comps. This will be used for subgroups or children compositions that aren't part of the main composition. And then I'll use 02. You can call it comps or main. I just go with main because it's more clear to me. It's the main composition, and we are ready to go. Let's go ahead and start a new composition. Just click that there, or you can press Command or Control N. We're going to stick to 1000 by 1000, exactly the same as our Illustrator artboard was. And so for this is the main composition, so we can just call it Heartburst Animation. We'll keep it at a frame rate of 60 FPS to have that nice silky smooth UI animation, and then let's put duration to 3 and have the background color to white so we can clearly see what we're doing, and then press OK. Alright, so our folder structure is already looking great because our heartburst animation is inside of main. There's nothing in pre-comps right now or assets. But in assets, if you press Command I or Control I, you can bring up an import dialog. And here we're gonna just look for wherever we had our assets folder, hopefully next to an After Effects folder. And then we have assets and heart.ai. Just one thing to note here is it'll come in as footage, this drop down here. We need to set this to composition, retain layer sizes, and that will just ensure our 1000 by 1000 artboard with our centered heart and everything matches perfectly. You don't need to really hit create composition or any of this other stuff. So you hit OK and we are good to go. So what After Effects has done is created a composition here that you can ignore. We actually don't need that. We're going to delete that. We have heart layers here, and then we have the heart AI folder. And so this is perfect. If we're inside of the main composition heartburst animation, we can drag in the heart.ai right in here, and there we go. It retains the Illustrator file type, which can be useful if you're not manipulating the asset at all. We are going to potentially, well, we're probably just going to use scale here for this animation. So you could keep that asset linked, but really to keep it vector and crisp and everything like that, what we're going to want to do is go to create shapes from vector layer, and it will just convert the Illustrator file into a vector format that works perfectly with After Effects, and you can manipulate vector points and all that stuff. So here you can just delete or discard or turn off that Illustrator layer because you don't need it anymore. I'll actually just rename this here because it likes to put outlines after everything once you do that and convert it, but I'll just say heart icon and we are good to go. Cool, so just a little demo of what we're gonna do here is basically use this transform. The heart will sort of grow once you click on it in theory, and then it will come down and then bounce a little bit, and at that point that is when the burst will take effect, and we'll have different sizes of circles all bursting out from this center point here, and it'll look great. I think what we can do first though before we move on to the circle burst is just pick a nice color that we want to use that will represent, you know, that favorite color and everything. This can all be changed in development later, being that it's JSON and SVG format for development, but it's good to just work with, you know, what we intend the final assets to be. So we'll pick just something around this hex value here, not right on the red, but a little more magenta. All right, so now we're pretty much going to ignore this heart and turn it off for now and completely forget it exists. And we're going to go up to layer, new, and shape layer. So creating the burst effect, we're gonna have a shape layer that houses multiple shape types, multiple ellipses or circles. A shape layer is really just a group. So even though you would think maybe that's just a single circle element, it can actually hold groups of shapes. And so in here, we're going to go to add and then ellipse, or you can come up here and draw an ellipse with the ellipse tool, press add and fill, and there we go. It defaulted to some sort of red. We're actually going to want this to be similar to the magenta, but a little bit lighter, at least for what I'm going for. Cool. I'm going to reset this view to fit up to 100% and go into this ellipse path. And again, not scaling it with the transform because I like to work with what these exact or precise sort of pixel amounts are. And for this one, maybe we'll just bring it down to 50 and see what that looks like. So we have one little circle element, and we're going to use something called the repeater here in After Effects. Basically, we'll do a bunch of animations or a few keyframes to this one sole element, and repeater will cascade it into an array of perfectly spaced out circles that are in a larger circle shape, and they will emanate from the center and sort of scale out and shrink down like a burst. Cool, so before we go any further, again, we want to make sure we're naming this properly and keeping things organized in a logical way. So if you click on this layer and press enter, then we can edit this label here, or you can right click and rename. We'll just call this burst dots. And from there, what we're going to want to do first is group these elements. So the ellipse path, which we can just call dot one or circle or something like that. We'll select both of these, fill and dot, press Command G or group shapes. And then here we will rename this to dot groups. Setting up this group structure in advance will allow us to get as complex as we want to with these dots while having one parent repeater really working its magic on multiple shapes here. So with that in place, let's select on contents. Make sure we're not going inside the group for this. Select on contents and hit add and repeater. And for the repeater, what you can see it's done is just add 2 dots equally spaced apart, exactly replicating the first dot. So what we want to do is bump that number up to 8 and then go down to these transform repeater options. And we're going to want to actually turn this position X 100 down to 0, and it will put everything on the same dot. And then what we can do to sort of illustrate this point better, we're going to want to have this X position on this dot, something offset over here. So we'll just start with around 100 for position X on dot 1. Let's go back down to transformer repeater, and for rotation, click and do the 0x 0.0. So the degrees, the second input, not the first input. And here we want to type in 360, a full circle, divided by the number of copies, which in this case is 8. And then once we do that, it has a perfect circle spaced out according to 360 degrees divided by 8 in that full circle. And what we can do here is when we control this X value, this position of dot 1, that's when we're really controlling how this thing is moving outward. Our burst animation is just going to be animating this X parameter here in a basic sense, and then some other things like scale and opacity. So first, let's set this maybe something like 50, and they're really close together. We can start right at the beginning of this timeline, and we're going to turn on a keyframe, and we have 50 is our X parameter. And then let's go forward to, I don't know, maybe the 45th frame. We're probably gonna wanna tweak this. Actually, let's do 30 frames. And then we will just drag this X parameter out to really taking up the full distance here in this composition. So somewhere near the edge, the border like that. In my case, you know, maybe 423, or if you want some solid numbers, 425 works. So now what we have is this nice burst animation starting to come into effect here if I'm just dragging through the timeline and looking at this. To emulate pieces flying out and then sort of disintegrating, we're going to want them to scale down at the very end and also have the opacity go from 100 to 0. If I zoom in on this timeline to get a more closer micro look here, if I go to around this 20 frame, maybe we'll say at that point we hit the stopwatch, we will scale from this size down to something maybe half the size. So we'll go from 50, go to the end here, and if you hold shift, it will snap to whatever keyframes are over there. And then we'll press 25 by 25. Now you can see them shrink down at the very end, and it's looking great. So the same thing, we're actually going to use an opacity here. If we open up transform on the dot groups, hit the opacity at the same point the scale begins to go down, drag this and holding shift, snapping to this end keyframe, and then we will put the opacity down to 0. Potentially it doesn't have to go to 0, but I think that should have a good effect. So if I scrub through this, once it gets to that end point, it starts to shrink down and burst away. And we can tweak this later. We might have to if we come back up here and turn the heart on and then sort of audit what it looks like. Of course, this should be behind the heart. Just scrubbing through what that looks like. I already see this isn't quite doing what we need. So we can actually click on this heart and press down arrow or shift down to really go down pretty far. And then I think perhaps let's try scaling this heart down to like 90%. That's looking pretty good. I'm pretty happy with that. So we'll turn that heart back off and we'll go back into the dot burst. If you select this layer and press U, it's just gonna pull up all of the keyframes that you've already set and everything. And the way I like to work is set all my keyframes and then adjust the easing afterwards. It's just a little bit simpler and it lets you focus on sort of the blueprint or the structure of the keyframes before you go any further with them. So I think this covers everything we wanna do for the main burst dots. We're actually going to duplicate this ellipse group and adjust some of the parameters and have more circles bursting that add a little more variety to it. But for right now, we're good to go. Let's select all of these, right click, keyframe assistant, and go to easy ease. And things just shifted slightly, but really you can't really notice the difference by scrubbing. You have to hit play here, press spacebar and see what that looks like. Okay, and then after looking at this thing in real time, it is way too fast. Let's take up some of this real estate on the timeline, putting the marker to around 1 second with these keyframes selected. if you hold Option or Alt and drag, it's going to scale these keyframes proportionately from one another. So I'm gonna scale that out to around the 1 second mark and hit play and see what that looks like. And that seems a little bit too slow now, so we'll go actually back to the 45 frame mark, hold Option or Alt and then snap those in there and then preview that. Alright, so I'm starting to feel pretty good about that. I turned the heart on and previewed it there to see what that looks like more in a real context. But now what we can do is we're actually going to right click, pre-compose this, and still calling it burst dots. We can hit OK, and in the layers panel, let's just drag this into pre-comps here. And then we're going to jump inside of this burst dots, and it's just everything the same again, but in a separate composition. We'll press U on these. And now what we're going to do is adjust the speed graph on the easing curves. So with these keyframes selected, let's start with actually just the position keyframes selected, and then we'll hit the speed graph editor icon here, and then this is what we get. So for an explosion, essentially, a burst, we want it to start abruptly really fast and then sort of hang in the air and be a little bit slower. And so that's what you can visualize here. If we drag a marquee over this point here, we get this handlebar. We actually want to have this a little bit shorter and then do the same thing for this end point here. We want this one to be longer. And so what that's doing is that abrupt explosion and then sort of the slow down in the air is how you can visualize that. So we'll press play here and view that now. All right, the magic is starting to happen. Great. We're pretty happy with that. Now what we can do is move on to creating a more complex burst with duplicating this dot group here. So this is pretty cool. Similar to the other video where I did a loader animation, we're just using all of the power of the animations built into this first layer and then duplicating them to our heart's desire, excuse the pun, and then we'll see what happens. It just adds a lot of complexity with a really easy approach. So let's click on dot 1 and press Command or Control D, and now we have dot 2. After Effects is awesome like that. It will just sort of name, if there's a sequence, the following number. So now we have dot 2 here, and we're going to want to go somewhere in the timeline to view this, what we're doing. So right now it has a perfectly duplicated layer that looks exactly the same. Go somewhere near the end of this animation so we can see what's going on. Really at the end of the burst, we're going to want to make sure these dots are a little bit different, that they're in a little bit different location. And so since the animation is based on mostly the position here, we're going to want to adjust some of these parameters and see what happens. So if we just click on that Y axis and drag that up, we're going to be able to fill in those middle spaces in between the other circles. So mine ended up being around 162, and I think that should work. Now what we're going to want to do is, since we like this position, we still have this other position keyframe from the last dot. We're actually going to just drag this one over to that dot so it replaces it. So by the time it ends, it will end in that location that we were just sort of vetting out. Now sort of scrubbing around, you can see it's pretty cool, and there's a lot of variety you can do with this. If yours ends up looking a little bit different, I'm sure it will still look awesome and amazing just because of the nature of what Repeater is doing. So now the last thing I want to do is, since those smaller dots are the exact same size, I don't think that's as interesting. For these, I had 50 for the dot 1, and so 50 is still here in dot 2. Let's try to make these maybe half the size, so 25. And we're going to want to, it just added a keyframe. Remember our two scale keyframes over here where we go down from 50 to 25. We're going to want to replace that 50 with what we just added in 25. So if you're over that keyframe and then type 25, that works. And then for the final one, it's already at 25, so there's no scaling occurring technically. Maybe we go from 25 down to 15. So for dot 2, we scale 25 by 25 down to 15 by 15. And then scrubbing through, we can see what that looks like here. And looking at this thing in real time, there's something kind of weird happening if you followed along exactly how I've been doing it. It's really apparent when you press play that the smaller dots are moving a little bit differently than the large dots. And so what I am going to do is select these position keyframes, go into the editor, and looky here. This is kind of funky. I don't know why it did that. but we'll drag that down to the same plane and then we'll play that here, and I believe that should correct the issue. Okay, cool. Let's jump into the heart burst animation. We still need to adjust what the heart looks like when you tap it. We wanted it to sort of expand larger and then do a little bit of an elastic bounce when it goes down, and then that's when the burst effect will happen. One of the beauties of working with this pre-composition for burst dots is since we've triggered that at the very start of that composition here, we can drag this to any point we need, and so whenever the timeline hits the beginning of that composition, we know the burst animation will always start there, and so we can slide this thing around to wherever we need it. But we're actually going to just turn this thing off for now because we're going to focus on the heart and we don't need to be distracted by all these other moving parts. So going into the heart, we're going to just do a real simple scale animation to create that effect we were talking about. But it's going to take a little bit of nudging around this timeline to get it to feel just right. We want it to slowly increase and then sort of implode just a little bit and then come back home basically, right? So I'll undo that. At this first keyframe, we're going to start at just 0 and press the stopwatch to initiate phase 1, state 1 really. 90% is where we're at. We're gonna still start at 90%. Let's go somewhere substantially far, maybe 30 frames. We want it over 30 frames to increase up to 100%. That's 10%, so that should feel like a large enough scale for this effect. All right, now with that in mind, you might think we need 2 keyframes, one to shrink down and one back to 90% back home, which you could do. But the way I'm going to achieve this is with only 3 keyframes and using the graph editor to have that scale down occur, and I'll show what I mean in a second. So we want it to shrink down smaller than our first keyframe or smaller than back home, which is 90%. So if I go then up to 45 frames and then we shrink this down to 90, which is back home, we can still achieve the effect we're going for. So even though it's just going to shrink back to the regular size, what we're going to do is select all of these, right click, go to the easy ease again. We're actually going to click on heart icon, press U, so we're only dealing with scale and things are super clean. And then with those keyframes selected, we're going into the graph editor, and here is what we see. Make sure when you right click you're in edit value graph. We might go to speed graph as well, but these are slightly different visualizations. So here we have this slow ramp up and then the implosion, but we need to go below baseline. Just a little hint there of what I mean. And so first we'll select this beginning keyframe and we'll just really exaggerate this slow growth, and it will take a while to reach up to that 10% there. It has a slow growth and then it sort of slams down, but it just comes back home instead of below the baseline. So what we can actually do here is grab this handle downward. You could get a little bit of a visualization here. This line is the parameter, so it goes up, it comes down, and it's actually, if you can see, dipping below this 90%. So if I hover over this, we can see it's actually in this part getting down to 89.63. That's not super drastic. We can probably go down further. And if you hover over there, we're getting to around 89%, which is about 1% less than the 90 there. Okay, playing with it some more, I dragged this down a little more to like 88.5, and what I've noticed is it's going a little bit too fast. So again, our little trick, select all these keyframes coming back out to the main timeline, holding Option or Alt. We're going to drag these out to about 1 second here, and I'm just gonna snap in and make sure we're precise there to that 1 second mark, and then see what that looks like. I actually think that's looking pretty good. So we're gonna turn on this burst layer and see how it all looks together. Now the burst comes in a little bit slower. We want it to be sort of right when it hits this, maybe once it starts going down below baseline. So let's drag this over, maybe even to that first keyframe, and see how that looks. All right, I've been playing this thing back in real time and auditing it. Also, if you scroll in and out, you're looking at it pretty large. I like to scroll out or somewhere close to like 25% here and get it in a little bit closer perspective to 1-to-1 of what it might look like on, you know, a smaller screen or something like that. I'm just playing around with it, seeing if something sticks out as like a little bit better for my taste here. So what I'm gonna do is actually just mess with this a little bit. So I'm gonna pull all these position and scale keyframes from 45 to somewhere in between like 45 and 100. So maybe 53, and we'll drag those over there, and then we'll come back to the parent animation and play this. Having those keyframes pulled out a little bit, I think made it much more approachable, maybe a little softer and more friendly, and I actually really like that a lot, so I think I'm gonna call this good. Now in theory, this would start as a outlined heart, and once you click it, you get a little bit of haptic feedback. If it's on a mobile device, you get that little vibration, and then it turns red instantly. You swap that asset out for this one right away, and then you trigger the play, and it appears as though it turns pink and then bursts, and then it locks in that last frame there where it's fully pink. Also, don't be like me and save your file. Don't work in an untitled project. That was very bad. Don't do what I did there. You want this to be named properly right away, because stuff can go wrong and lots can happen, and then you lose all of your hard work there. All right, so we're finished, but the last thing we can do here to make sure this gets to our developers, or we want to just upload it and share it to Lottie Files, make sure you have the Lottie Files extension installed and everything. I already covered that in another video, my create a loader animation video, which I'll link here. But here, just go to extensions, Lottie Files. We have our compositions named out here. We're going to want to export Heartburst animation because that's what our main animation was called over here. So we press this little arrow and it will render it. And then it shows us our beautiful heart animation, and it will just keep looping that for eternity. And then we can hit upload and send it to our Lottie Files account. And whoop, there it is. We just made a Heartburst animation in After Effects. If you found this video helpful and you were able to follow along, please remember to like and subscribe and support the channel. If you run into any troubles or problems with After Effects, just reach out to me and we'll get that all squared away so you can be making cool animations like this one here. Cool, well, I suppose that's it. So thanks y'all, I heart you, and until next time, super nice guy out.